photograph sat on the mantelpiece, slightly askew, the way some memories refuse to stay perfectly upright. In it, Claire and Adam stood beneath a canopy of fairy lights, fresh-faced and small in all the right places, young lovers who believed the world had joined them in their certainty. Claire's laugh in the photo looked like the kind that would last forever. Now the mantel was bare except for the empty frame. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the last of Adam's cologne he had forgotten to pack. Claire sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, legal forms, a final page circled in red by the clerk at the courthouse. The signature at the bottom of each page reasserted the fact: divorce finalized. It wasn't a courtroom drama. There were no raised voices, no accusing families in polished shoes. It had been quieter, more ordinary, a series of small decisions, like choosing to arrive 5 minutes late, forgetting a birthday, shrugging off a worry that later grew teeth. Quiet had the habit of becoming permanent. She traced the rim of an empty mug and imagined the way his hand had once fit there, warm and steady. For a long time she sat that way, feeling the house, listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator as if it might say something consoling. There was nothing but the hum and the memory, and a slow, oppressive loneliness that felt stranger than anger. Claire and Adam met in a rain that had no business being romantic. Umbrellas collided at a bus stop. She dropped her scarf. He offered a hand. She accepted. Conversation arrived easily, the kind that skips small talk and goes straight to the parts people usually hide until later. They discovered the same taste in old movies and the same impatience for indecision. They married because it felt like the only sensible thing to do with a love that made sense of the messy parts of themselves. Their wedding was small and honest, an old church, a borrowed suit, a cake with a slightly lopsided frosting. Neighbors came, friends came, the world approved. They moved into a modest apartment with light that caught dust in the way it organizes beauty. They started a life together the way most people do, gradually, insistently, by adding things. A coffee maker, a bookshelf, a dog that slept at their feet. Adam worked at a small architecture firm. He was the kind of man who noticed details, how light fell through a particular window, how a child's drawing looked better when framed simply. He had patience that felt like an even shoreline. Claire taught children and adults and threw herself into projects with a quiet, fierce energy. She liked the rush of building something in words, in lessons, in plans. She loved the precise calculation of setting an objective and achieving it. It made her feel competent. The children came when they were ready, first Jonah, then Elise. Jonah had Adam's quiet eyes and Claire's restless curiosity. Elise was a small comet with a laugh that changed the air. Parenthood rearranged everything: schedules, sleep, ambitions. It also made the house louder in the best way. For a while, the story was simple. Love, then family, then the small satisfactions of life threaded through shared mornings and late-night conversations that left them both feeling full. The hardening came like frost, slow, almost invisible at first. A missed coffee here, a late cancellation there. Claire began to keep lists of grievances in her head the way she used to keep lesson plans. She cataloged evenings when Adam sat on the couch with a book and didn't notice that she had been waiting for his attention. She noted the way he never suggested they do anything spontaneous, the way he seemed content with the life they had built while she wanted something else, something bigger, riskier, more her. Adam noticed other things. He noticed Claire's silence at the table, the steady drifting of her eyes toward travel blogs, podcasts, people who seemed to be searching for proof that they were still becoming. He tried conversations, gentle, testing, but they landed stiffly, as if there were invisible hands preventing them from reaching one another. He found that when he asked how to help, it made her angrier. When he tried to change, she misread it as an attempt to fix her instead of joining her. Outside pressures piled up. Claire's job demanded more. Curriculum changes, committees, always more work. Adam's firm tightened its belts. He came home with small defeats he did not bother to recount. Money, time, lack of sleep. These were the scaffolding around the real issue, which was something less tangible. A widening distance between what Claire wanted to become and what Adam's presence made possible. She used to want more, a friend observed once with unintended cruelty. She used to be fearless. Fearless? Claire heard the word like a verdict. She remembered daring things, backpacking alone through a country that intimidated her, speaking in front of a crowd and trembling with exhilaration. She had wanted to keep being that woman. Instead, she felt like she was living the shape of someone else's life, a life that looked tidy from outside but pinched at the edges. It was not a single betrayal. It was not another woman or a crime of omission. The slow erosion was enough. The argument that changed everything. Arguments came and went in their marriage. This one arrived on a rainy Thursday and carried the weight of months. Jonah had a fever that refused to break. Elise wanted to be held and would not sleep. Claire had a conference call at 8 and a lecture at 9. Adam had a deadline and a model to finish. Claire arrived at the kitchen table with a list of the day's tasks. Adam was at his laptop. The house was a blur. She asked him if he could take Jonah so she could run to campus after the call. He nodded without looking up and promised he would. She paced, rehearsed the email, then realized Jonah was still asleep and Adam had left for the firm. He had left because he thought Claire needed space. He needed time to think. He had assumed she would sleep with Jonah and handle the morning. He had assumed a lot, the way people living in long relationships do. Assumptions become rules. She called him in anger. He answered with patience that sounded unfamiliar to her. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Don't worry." She heard in that sentence a minimization of her frantic schedule, her career, her sudden realization that she was doing most of the emotional labor. She heard, too, his tiredness. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that his care came in steady, small things and not the dramatic rescues she sometimes craved. The argument detonated. Voices rose, not explosive so much as edged with fatigue. Old grievances surfaced like barnacles on a hull. "You never take me seriously," she said, the words clumsy and blunt. "You never take my work seriously. You act like everything will be fine if we just ignore it." "And what do you want me to do, Claire?" Adam answered, voice keener than usual. "Blow everything up. Move us to the middle of nowhere so you can teach at a workshop every month. I'm here, I try, but I can't." "You don't try," she said. "At least not enough." The argument ended in silence. They did not sleep in the same bed that night. Silence thickened into a wedge. The decision came bolstered by logic and lonely courage. Divorce, to her, began as a rational solution. If what she wanted, some unknown, uncharted expansion of her life, could not exist while she was tethered to a pattern that had calcified, then divorce would be the clean way to carve that new space. She told herself practical things. Couples grow apart, not every marriage lasts. She imagined that ending might hurt for a time but would ultimately be freeing for both. There was also a streak of pride. She did not want to be a person who endured quiet unhappiness because it was easier than being brave. Perhaps bravery, she thought, required severing what felt stifling. She spoke with a lawyer. She spoke with friends. She practiced speeches in the shower, measured her sentences like curriculum objectives. When she told Jonah and Elise, she tried to make it small and steady. She said, "Mom and Dad are going to live in different houses, but we both love you very much." They believed her words like children do, because adults say them. The house divided itself into neat halves. Claire would take the upstairs room. Adam would keep the dining table that held his blue coffee mug. They drew up a custody schedule that read reasonable on paper. The hardest parts were not in the documents. Leaving felt like cutting a familiar fabric into two. She packed with precision and fear. She disliked the way moving boxes into the living room finally made the change visible. Friends came to help lift heavy furniture. Neighbors brought casseroles, as if food could stitch what would not stitch. Adam stood on the front steps as she placed the final box in the car. He hugged her with an unfamiliar lightness. "I want you to be happy," he said. She wanted to believe him. What she heard, under that sentence, was the acceptance of a different future. He was already making the phrase into a benediction. It comforted her in a way that made her ashamed. At first, the new normal felt electric. Claire slept when she wanted, though less than she expected. She took late coaching classes and subbed for workshops across the city. She traveled for a week to a seminar and returned feeling, for a moment, luminous. There was an exhilaration in decision-making that belonged only to her. She had chosen this path, and the choice felt like autonomy. But autonomy has costs. The days when the children lived with Adam were long and noisy in a way Claire missed when she was not present. She missed their small rituals, the way Jonah would tap his fingers before a spelling test, how Elise would sing nonsense songs as she brushed her hair. She missed the little grievances that had once irritated her. Adam's tendency to leave a light on, his habit of forgetting to put fresh towels on the rack. Those small annoyances had humanized him. Without them, his steadiness looked like a kind of monument she could not find her way back to. Conversations with Adam became functional. Texts arranged pickups, discussed school events, negotiated holidays. They spoke of the children, not of the long and tender things between adults. When they did meet, it was often in neutral places: the school auditorium, a coffee shop near the library. They behaved with the civility of two people who had tried to undo each other and had found only the edges. Claire watched from the windows of social life as other parts of her old identity dissolved. Friends gossiped less. Some drifted away because divorce is an awkward bridge. She dated briefly, each encounter a thin attempt to find something that matched the emptiness she felt. The dates always ended with Claire retreating inward, noticing the other person's small imperfections with too much clarity, as if fear had taught her to catalog flaws before they could cause pain. And slowly, very slowly, regret settled in. It did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived like winter light, a softer, angrier sun. She would open the fridge at night and catch herself thinking about how Adam always bought the wrong kind of yogurt, and then she would feel foolish for missing such a thing. She told herself she had been right to leave. She told herself that life required sacrifices for growth. There were moments of grace. Jonah drew her pictures of the family and left them on the kitchen table with explanations. "For when you miss us." Elise wrote notes asking to bake cookies together on Wednesdays. Claire clutched these small offerings like lifebuoys and planned whole afternoons around them. Cookies, library trips, a toddler's imaginative theater. Those afternoons were good. They were also painfully finite. She and Adam found a rhythm in co-parenting that felt professional and chilly. They attended parent-teacher meetings together and cheered from opposite sides of recitals. When Jonah forgot his science project, Adam delivered it with the quiet competence of a man who took responsibilities seriously. Claire recognized, with a sting, how patient and steady he had always been. Sometimes, late at night, Claire would text him a picture of something silly Elise had done or a message that felt like a hand reaching out. "She wore her shoes on the wrong feet again. She's a tiny explorer." He would reply with a string of heart emojis and a brief joke. She would smile at the screen, and relief would wash over her for a moment before the old ache reappeared. She began to measure happiness in small exchanges. It diminished everything else. The awakening arrived in an ordinary hospital waiting room with plastic chairs and a vending machine that only took coins. Adam had collapsed at work. Tests were slow in telling their story. When the doctor finally spoke to Claire, because Adam was at home with Jonah and Elise that day, he explained in quiet clarity that Adam had something aggressive in his liver. He moved through medical terminology as if reciting a foreign language. Claire felt the room tilt. It was like hearing a sentence in another life. Someone else's tragedy played for her in slow motion. She called Adam. His voice, when he answered, was close and calm. He asked her to come. There were arrangements and hushed instructions. The children were at school. The world continued, except for the small universe between them, which had shifted on an axis. At the hospital, the man she had argued with and the one she had left lay on a bed looking younger than the years that had sat on his shoulders. Machines hummed a mechanical lullaby. Claire took his hand and found it as it had always been, damp, warm, capable of being held. She could not find a place to start. Words felt both necessary and worthless. He smiled at her, a small, private thing. "You look tired," he said. "You look tired, too," she answered, and felt like a child again, wanting everything to be simple. They began to talk in the way people do when life compresses into clarity, not with the sprawling, formal confessions of old, but with a stripped, urgent honesty. Adam spoke of his fear. He admitted that he had been well aware for a while of the distance between them and had hoped time would stitch it back together. He admitted to mistakes of omission, the times he had failed to recognize the depth of her restlessness. Claire apologized for the ways she had pushed him away, and for choosing separation when perhaps conversation could have been a bridge. She apologized for the nights she had left without understanding how that would change their future. There was no theatrical admission, just a series of sincere, unpolished sentences that clung to the sterile air like desperate birds. They reconciled in the only way they could: small gestures, a squeeze of a hand, a promise to try to be better in the time they had. They made arrangements, spoke of the future in halting sentences, and then were given a few days of cautious hope when treatment began. Claire felt like she had been given a second chance with a brittle clock attached. For a time, she believed that this was the mercy of the story. That pain could motivate repair. That loss could be a teacher. She left the hospital feeling raw and awake, carrying a fragile optimism like a glass ornament. Treatment was invasive and merciless in the way of modern medicine, chemotherapy cycles that emptied Adam physically and emotionally. Some days he looked like himself, other days he was a pale echo. Claire tried to be present in the way she had promised, but the past had carved lines that did not simply erase. They sat together in the living room on evenings that smelled like soup broth and medicine. The children sat nearby, drawing or playing video games with something solemn in their eyes. The house had become a hospital without walls. Friends brought casseroles again, this time with an urgency that had not existed during the quiet months of separation. Amid the treatments, old arguments surfaced like submerged stones. Claire found herself replaying their fights, late-night emails she had sent in anger, the way she had packed her bags at dawn, the few things she had said that had cut deeper than intended. Regret grew not as a single weapon, but as a cumulative weight. Every memory felt more luminous and brittle. Adam, for his part, was generous in his small kindnesses. He did not use his illness as leverage. He did not complain about lost years. He offered Claire his gratitude for returning and for being there in the way compassionate people are, honestly, without theatrics. But gratitude is not a balm to erase complex history. At some point, Adam asked Claire why she had left. She did not have a clean, single answer. There were the reasons she had rehearsed for months: the need for autonomy, the unanswered desire to be recognized beyond mother and partner. But confronting the man she had left and seeing how he listened with such painful care made those reasons sound thin and self-protective. "I thought I needed space to become myself," she said finally, voice brittle. "I thought the only way to grow was to make a clean break." Adam's hand tightened around hers. "I wish we had tried harder," he said. "I wish we had been braver together." They existed in a place of truth that hospitals create, stripped of pretense, filled with the raw edges of what we are when everything else is removed. On a sunlit day between chemotherapy cycles, there was a small miracle, not a cure but a fragile day of ease. Adam felt strong enough to sit on the porch. The children played in the yard, their laughter an imperfect soundtrack to Claire, ache. It was the kind of day that, in a better story, would be the turning point. They ate lunch on paper plates and talked about small things: Jonah's math project, Elise's new friend. Claire found herself telling a story she had never shared, a childhood memory of a father who taught her to swim, a small, perfect lesson about trust. Adam listened with the concentration of someone who wanted to learn everything about the woman beside him. She wanted, in that suspended hour, to stitch herself back into the fabric of their life. She wanted to make up for the months that had been eaten by pride. She wanted to be the person who mailed herself into their family again. But the day was tender, not transformative. It could not unwind what had been done. When the sun declined, Adam looked at her with a weariness that belonged to someone older than his years. "Promise me something," he said. She was ready to promise anything. "If there are things we cannot fix," he continued, "let us at least not make our children pay by being confused about love." She promised. The promise felt like a small, fragile victory. They returned to the hospital the next day with the same routines, the same anxieties, and the same small hopes. Claire clung to that day the way people cling to a warm pebble under their pillow, treasuring it, but knowing it would cool. Not every story gives a clear arc of redemption. Life is less merciful, and the world does not always wait for us to find better ways. One morning, when the season shifted and clouds stacked in a way that made the light look washed, Adam's voice was a whisper. The treatments had slowed the disease but not stopped it. Tests showed progression. There was a decision to be made about further treatment. Aggressive measures with diminishing returns or palliative care that bought comfort at the cost of time. They chose comfort. They chose the small things, better food, more afternoons in the sun, less time in sterile rooms. The decision was married to a quiet resignation and to a stubborn, human desire to set boundaries around suffering. On a rainy November evening, while Claire read quietly on the couch and the children watched an old movie, Adam fell asleep and did not wake up. There was no dramatic hospitalization in the end, no last word that explained the universe. He simply exhaled in sleep, and the world took a breath itself. Claire found him there, his hand cold around the remote, the television murmuring images that now felt absurdly trivial. The house, that faithful witness, held its breath. Grief is a strange currency. There is a shock that goes electric through the body, that causes people to do impossible things, call numbers from memory, line up a funeral plan as if life were something bureaucratic. There is then a wearier grief that is not loud but obstinate, a steady erosion. For Claire, there was no melodramatic collapse at the moment of death, only an absolute, unignorable emptiness. She screamed once. That wild, animal sound that tears out of the chest is when the world knows it is unmade, and afterward the scream had spent itself. The children came running. Jonah's face registered confusion that was equal parts fear and a child's understanding that something big had ended. Elise clung to her father as if she could hold him together. Friends arrived with food in hands and practical sobs. There was a funeral, words that echoed in the chest like distant thunder. People said things about being brave, about living a life well-loved. All true statements, and yet somehow small. The hardest part was not the funeral. Funerals provide a structure to grief. There is a date, ritual, and a community that gathers. The hardest part was what came after, the days that opened into an unforgiving quiet. People checked in for a while, leaving casseroles and awkward silences. Then the world resumed its ordinary indifference. Work schedules reasserted themselves. The children returned to school and found in their classmates the banal solace of graded homework and lunchtime gossip. Claire found that the world had not stopped its basic functioning. It had merely rearranged itself around the absence. She found herself visiting places they had once loved. She walked to the school auditorium where Jonah had once performed. She lingered outside the bakery where Adam used to buy the wrong kind of bread. Memory made these places thicker with meaning. She kept reaching for the past like someone trying to snatch a scarf from a table and finding their hand empty. Guilt arrived and nested. She thought of the times she had left in anger, the nights they had slept apart, the way she had imagined her leaving as a noble act. She thought of the arguments she had not softened with kindness. She thought of the years she had not learned to be brave together. She thought of the very human smallness of her choices and how decisions are not made in a vacuum. The children needed her. They needed more than anyone had expected. With Adam gone, the patterns changed again. Custody became a memory rather than a schedule. Claire became both parents and the full shape they had not known how to construct. She was tired in a more permanent sense, the kind of tired that printed itself into bone. She was also haunted by the knowledge that forgiveness had come, but too late for the primary reconciliation she most desired. A week after the funeral, when the house had fallen into a silence that was inhabited rather than empty, Claire found an envelope tucked into one of Adam's old books. The handwriting was his, neat, small, dated a month before the diagnosis had become public. It began, simply, "Claire, if you are reading this, then perhaps I was never eloquent enough in speech. There are a few things I want you to know." He wrote about how he had loved her, not with the theatrical lines of novels, but with a steady, lived affection. He admitted his failings, the times he had assumed things, the nights he had retreated into quiet instead of meeting her. He wrote about his gratitude for her return in the hospital, not as a concession, but as an act of courage he had been humbled by. He wrote, with a silly flourish, about the photograph on the mantel. There was a passage that made her chest break. "If there are regrets, I have my share. If there were things we had done differently, I would have welcomed them. But love is not accounted only in the loud rescues. Sometimes love is keeping a glass of water by the bedside. Sometimes it is noticing the way the light hits the floor at noon. I hope you can forgive yourself, not because forgiveness is cheap, but because it is the clearest way to live on. She read the letter again and again until the ink smudged beneath her thumb. It did not banish her regret. It did not turn back clocks, but it offered something like mercy. She had been hopping for a bridge. She found instead a small, personal absolution written in his voice. She could not help thinking, is the forgiveness of the dead a consolation or a kind of cruel kindness? Ultimately, no answer settled inside her. But she folded the letter and placed it inside her braille of memories, a talisman she would carry. Months passed in a blur of school forms and routines. The children grew through their grief in ways that both broke and reassembled them. Jonah became quieter, more thoughtful. Elise held onto rituals like anchors. Claire taught them to cook simple meals, to arrange small bouquets, to remember birthdays in new ways. They survived. Survival did not feel like triumph, it felt like continuation. Claire returned to work slowly. She noticed how flinching she was around people who treated divorce as a verdict. She listened to their stories and found herself less impatient with human stubbornness. She kept Adam's cup in the house. She did not move back to their old apartment. She could not make the world unfold as if the years had not been rearranged. People asked whether she regretted leaving. It was a question that now felt too simple for what she knew. In the quiet of the night, she would sometimes whisper apologies into a pillow, not because a broken marriage is a crime, but because a life is built from tiny choices, and each one moved the arc in ways she had not imagined. She began to write again, not the ambitious essays she had thought she needed, but small, honest pieces, notes on love, on the terrible commodity of time, on the quiet work of forgiveness. Her voice, tempered and older, found small corners of readership. She spoke in public sometimes about the complexity of choices, about how to hold contradiction without becoming defined by it. To the outside eye, the story looked complete. A marriage, a divorce, an illness, a death, a life rebuilt. But inside, she carried a persistent sense of what might have been. She cared for her children with an intensity that was both fierce and tender. She tried not to make her grief the center of their lives. She tried to teach them to love courageously and with patience, so they would know that sudden decisions could have consequences that do not yield to regret. Sometimes, late at night, she would stand by the window with a mug of tea and imagine the life she might have led had she stayed and learned to be braver with him. Those imaginings were not fashioned from spite. They were exercises in seeing. They were also, she understood with a cold honesty, exercises in understanding that certain doors, once closed, remain stubbornly shut. The story does not end with vindication. The sad ending arrives as a mosaic of small, unalterable facts. Adam was gone. The children still loved their mother, but their love had rearranged around loss. The friends who stood at the funeral continued to live lives that were, gently, indifferent. Claire's ambition found new forms. She met people and traveled and sometimes laughed. But there was always the ache, the sense that a necessary thing had been auctioned away for a dream that had not yet come true. There is a particular kind of regret that does not demand punishment. It asks instead for witness. Claire learned to be honest with herself about her motives and her fears, about the part of her that had equated leaving with empowerment, and about the part that had run when closeness felt constricting. She also learned to accept Adam's written mercy, to let his words be a salve that did not erase but eased. Years later, Jonah, now a young adult, would sit with his mother and say, softly, the kind of sentence that folds time into two. Dad forgave you. I know he did. I just wish I had more time with him. Claire nodded and felt the truth of his sentence like a small collapse. Forgiveness from the dead is a complicated gift. It is not an answer to all questions. It is not a ladder that can pull us back through the halves we have made. It is, perhaps, a light turned on in a room you cannot return to. The light shows everything as it is, and then the world asks you to move forward anyway. She lived forward. She kept his letter. The photograph that had once been askew now hung straight on the wall. She taught her children how to hold grief without letting it become architecture. She learned to speak, gently, about the mistakes adults make. She understood that love is many things, a steady hand and also a decision to keep trying even when the pattern is hard. It was the painful awareness of her own failings that taught her to ask better questions of herself. A memory in the drawer. On a rainy afternoon many years later, Claire opened a drawer and found a small stone Jonah had painted in childhood, a gift he had left for her the week he left for college. The stone was chipped at the edges, the paint dulled, but the gesture remained a bright, aching thing. She held it in her hand and thought of Adam, of his quiet patience, his small acts of care that had defined a lifetime. She thought of the night she had walked away and the months she had spent chasing a freedom that came at a savage cost. She thought of the letter in the book and the way forgiveness sometimes arrives after the doors are bolted. Her sadness did not vanish. It softened, and in the softening she discovered a steadier love. Not the loud, spectacular love of storybook endings, but the slow, ordinary love that supports children through long nights and helps them sweep floors and make soup. It was love shaped by absence. She placed the stone on the mantel beside Adam's photograph. For a moment, she imagined him laughing at her careful attempts to place things exactly where they belonged, as if organization could reassemble life. She smiled through the tears. Some choices, she had learned, change everything. Some doors once closed do not reopen. The story did not offer easy justice or sudden redemption. It offered instead a quiet ledger, what was kept, what was lost, and what, finally, could be carried forward as a promise to those she loved most. In the end, Claire lived with the weight of her choices. She learned to hold them and to let them exist without defining every moment. She taught her children to love and to be brave in different ways. And on rainy afternoons, when the light slanted through the window just so, she would sit by the mantel and remember that love is often not a single act but a series of smaller ones, any one of which can be the difference between staying and going. That knowledge did not make her guilt disappear. It taught her instead the shape of humility, the understanding that regret is a teacher if you are willing to learn.